We're going to start off this lecture by talking about the levels of organization, specifically in organisms. And we can look at a human for an example, but this is true of just about any multicellular organism we look at. So, the largest kind of unit we could look at is the individual organism itself. And if we break that organism down, we'll find that that organism is made of a bunch of different systems. So, for example, the systems in your body might include the muscular system, the skeletal system, the circulatory system, the nervous system, and all those systems together make up that organism. And then those systems themselves are made of individual organs. So, if, for example, we take a look at your digestive system, we might find that it's made of your stomach and your intestines and your esophagus and your liver and your spleen and all those parts. So, all these organs together are making up those systems. And then if we break those organs down, we'll find that they're made of tissues. So if, for example, we look at just your stomach, we'll find that your stomach might be made of, say, about 4 different tissues: muscle tissue, connective tissue, nervous tissue, and epithelial tissue. And those 4 tissues can come together to make those organs. And then those tissues themselves are made of these individual components called cells. And this is what we're going to be focused on today. Cells are the smallest unit of any organism. We say smallest unit in that cells are the smallest unit that can exist by themselves. So just looking at this picture, you can see that each one of these cells, well, they all have stuff or parts in them, but those parts can't exist by themselves. So the parts of a cell must all be present to make a living cell function. So that's why we say these cells are the smallest unit of life. So that's what we're going to be focused on today, and we're just going to go over a brief introduction to the cell, talk about the different parts of the cell, but we're actually going to start with the discovery of the cell, or something called cell theory. So cell theory came about a long time ago, basically with the invention of the microscope. And the microscope allowed the scientists to look at what actually made up living organisms. And the first person to do this was a scientist called Robert Hooke. And he was the first one to use a microscope to observe the living parts of a cell and living parts of an organism. And he called them cells. He actually named them cells because they looked like little cubes, they looked like little compartments, and they reminded him of kind of like prison cells. So he named them cells. And then from there, a series of scientists kind of made more discoveries based on Hooke's research. Leeuwenhoek was the first person to observe single-celled organisms. So we saw those in pond water, just little cells that would move by themselves that didn't make up any larger organism. Sheldon discovered that all plants were made of cells. So he looked at different plants and said, oh, this plant's made of a cell. All plants must be made of cells. And then Schwann did the same thing for animals. He looked at different types of tissues from meat and things, and discovered that all animals are made of cells. And then Virchow discovered that cells actually come from existing cells. So he was the first one to witness one cell split into 2 and discover that cells could come from other cells. Now, these kind of 5 scientists together came up with kind of what we call cell theory. It's not really a theory, we know it to be true, but kind of 3 rules that cells follow. And the first is that all living things are made of cells. So if you're a living thing, if you're alive, you're made of cells. Number 2 is that cells are the most basic building block of life, meaning that they're the smallest unit that can exist by themselves. And number 3 is that cells only come from other cells. So you get cells from other cells, as simple as that. And those 3 things kind of drive our understanding of all living things on the planet. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about the basics of cells and the groups of cells. We're going to start off with actually just the how cells work. So when we take a look at cells themselves, we find that cells have parts of themselves called organelles. And organelles literally translates to little organs. Now, they're not really organs, but they're just a fancy name, a funny name for the parts of a cell. And what we're going to find is that based on the type of cell, we're going to find different organelles. And every organelle has a different shape and a different job. So basically, these cells, organelles, are made of different proteins that can attach to different things. But basically, they all have special jobs in the cells. And so, like I said, there's different types of cells, and each different kind of cells has different organelles. So we're going to break down our cells into 2 groups. The first one is prokaryotic cells. The first type of cell is prokaryotic cells, and these are, we're going to call them the most basic types of cells. And prokaryotic cells are special, and it's really easy to remember. The only place we're going to find prokaryotic cells is in bacteria. So bacteria are the only example of prokaryotes that we see. No other organism for us in this class will be prokaryotic. So prokaryotic cells you can think of as bacteria, and usually, almost always, they're single-celled organisms. So they're very tiny. So when we look at prokaryotic cells, what we're going to see is that they're very simple. They only have three parts. They have a cell membrane, which is the outer wall of the cell, and a cytoplasm, the liquid inside the cell. And then they usually have DNA. All cells have DNA. And they usually have ribosomes, which allow them to make proteins. So prokaryotic cells only have these four basic components to them, and that's why they're so simple. A cell membrane, DNA, and ribosomes. Some prokaryotic cells might have other organelles, but for the most part, you're going to see just these. The other group of cells are called eukaryotic cells, and eukaryotic cells come in four types or flavors: animal, plant, fungus, and protist cells. So you're obviously familiar with animals and plants and funguses and things like mushrooms. Protists are small little organisms that are made of eukaryotic cells. We don't talk too much about them in this class, but they're just that fourth category. But we focus mainly on plant and animal cells. So plants and animals are made of eukaryotic cells, which are much more complex. They have a lot more organelles. So I'm going to start with animal cells. So animal cells have all the prokaryotic organelles, so the membrane, the cytoplasm, the DNA, the ribosomes, but they also have lots of additional organelles. One is that they have a nucleus, and this helps protect the DNA. All eukaryotic cells have a nucleus. That's actually one of the driving characteristics that makes eukaryotic cells different than prokaryotic cells, is that they have a nucleus to protect their DNA. They have something called a smooth endoplasmic reticulum, which helps them make proteins, which helps them make fats and lipids and things like that. And they have a rough endoplasmic reticulum. And you can see these brown dots that represent the ribosomes earlier. The rough endoplasmic reticulum is rough because it's covered in ribosomes. It has something called a Golgi apparatus that helps transport materials around the cell. It's got a lysosome that helps clean up the cell. Vacuoles that are helped to use to store items inside the cell, and mitochondria that help the cell make energy. And then plant cells have all those organelles, plus they have an additional few. They have chloroplasts, which help them go through photosynthesis. We talked about that when we learned about our producers. They have an extra layer of protection called a cell wall. So this might be the cell's membrane. Around that, you have an additional cell wall that helps protect the cell. And one other note is that when we talk about organelles, we're going to learn that plant cells have very large vacuoles and animal cells have small ones. And this is important because plant cells are going to use those vacuoles to store water. So we're going to talk more about these organelles and these types of cells in the future. So that was a lot of information to talk about the different components, but we were looking at each organelle individually in the future because there's a lot to learn about them. But that basically breaks down the two types of cells. So for just a quick summary and kind of what you need to know for the sake of this lecture is just prokaryotic cells versus eukaryotic cells. Prokaryotic cells are very small and they're very simple. They only have a few components, some DNA, a cell membrane, usually some ribosomes, some mitochondria, but that's basically it. Eukaryotic cells are much larger and they're much more complex. They have a lot more parts. And the driving characteristic that makes them different is that prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus surrounding their DNA, and eukaryotic cells have a nucleus surrounding their DNA. So it's all about how they protect that DNA. Prokaryotic cells do not. Eukaryotic cells do protect their DNA. And then you can see animals versus plants, very similar because they're both eukaryotic, but different things, like they might have your cell wall around a plant and you have chloroplasts in a plant. That makes plants very different. And then here's kind of all three together. Here's a prokaryotic cell, like a bacteria, very small, very simple, only a few components or parts to it. And here your animal and plant cells are eukaryotes that are much more complex, and they have nucleuses surrounding their DNA, lots more parts. And then just kind of here's some colored pictures of what they might look like. So again, a prokaryotic cell, very simple, bacteria, no nucleus around its DNA. and these must be eukaryotic cells because they do have a nucleus around their DNA. Bonus points if you can identify this as the plant cell because A, it has an extra layer of protection, the cell wall, and it has the green chloroplasts that make it a plant cell.